Hello and welcome to the next edition of Fridays with Fintelekt. My name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintelekt Advisory Services, a company focused on research, training, and advisory in AML and CFT. My guest today is Sydney Asubo, Executive Director of the Financial Intelligence Authority of Uganda, which is essentially the FIU of the country. Sydney holds the distinction of being the first head of the authority since its formation around 6 years back. Sydney, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today, and welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So, Sydney, let me kick off, this conversation with maybe some background information from you. So, the FIA was created by the AML Act of 2013, and it actually came into being in July 2014. So, could you give us a quick overview of the FIA, maybe some of the challenges it faced since it was formed, and how you were able to galvanize the financial sector and also the other reporting entities or accountable persons to ensure that the reporting regime becomes adequate, especially as you're approaching your 6th anniversary now?
Thank you very much for that question. Now, the FI Uganda, we found ourselves in quite a very unique situation when we were created almost 6 years ago. Now, obviously, like any other FIU, we are the center for receiving suspicious transaction reports and do all the other things that other FIUs do. In our case, ours is an administrative FIU, which is a standalone FIU. We're not associated with any other. We're not any other organization. So operationally, we are independent, standalone, and we're self-accounting vote. Now, at the time we were created was in 2014. There was, of course, pressure from the Financial Action Task Force, and because Uganda was on the FATF grey list, one of the requirements in the action plan was that Uganda should set up an FIU. So that was the background under which we were created. So when we were created, we had no time to settle in. There was no period for honeymoon. We just had to go straight away, because as soon as we were set up, the responsibility for ensuring that all the action plan items in the action plan were agreed with the ICRG in 2014 fell now on the FIA. So at that time, of course, as you know, with the first round, with the FATF third round of assessments, it was purely done on technical compliance. So we had so many technical compliance deficiencies. So one of our core functions at that time was to ensure that our legislation is brought up to the required international standards. So we had to amend a number of laws, including the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Now, we found ourselves in a very unique challenge, because our draft legislation was made in the year 2001, but it took 12 years for the law to be passed. So by the time the law was passed in 2013, many of the international standards had changed. So already the law was passed with provisions which were obsolete. Now that meant that immediately we were created, because this was during the old standards. So when the new standards were set up in 2012, the law was already obsolete in certain provisions. So immediately this law had to be amended. We also had a deficiency with our definition of terrorism financing, so the anti-terrorism law had to be amended. There was also a challenge of that there were two reporting centers for suspicious transactions, the central bank and the FIU. So that also had to be harmonized. The Financial Institutions Act, which made the central bank which provided the central bank with responsibility receiving STRs, also had to be amended. So those were the challenges we found ourselves in. And then also in the region, in the Eastern and Southern African region, Uganda was the only country that did not have an FIU. So, and that's why there was a lot of pressure on the country to make sure that this FIU is created. So we had no time to rest as soon as we were created. And of course, it was a very small unit, but we had a lot of support from the Ministry of Finance. Now, because the legislation was new, the first challenge we had was that this was new legislation. So anything, of course, any new legislation, that means you have to do a lot of teaching. You have to do a lot of education, not only of the reporting entities, but also of the other stakeholders, the law enforcement agencies, and even ourselves. We had to make sure we get staff who are well-grounded on FIU work. And because we're new and we're now the experts, because everybody else in the country was coming to us. So I had the task of assembling a team that was knowledgeable on MLCFT issues. And this was not easy because it was not a crime. Money laundering was not a crime. So you cannot build expertise in an area.
Right.
It's not a crime. So, but eventually we were able to get a small team. We trained ourselves, and then we also have to educate not only the reporting entities, but also the law enforcement agencies and the other stakeholders, including the financial sector regulators and the DNF BPs. Now, the second issue was the acceptance of this. Now, Uganda is a largely cash-based economy. So many of the provisions were, and it's still a challenge, it was a challenge then and it's still a challenge up to now, because many of the provisions are ideal for, are not so ideal for cash-based economies. So adopting policies that are suitable for a cash-based economy like ours was a bit of a difficulty. Now, in addition to being a cash-based economy, there is also a lot of informal business. So capturing the informal businesses, the transactions done by informal businesses, coupled with the cash-based economy, coupled with the fact that ours are porous borders. We have so many porous borders. So the issue of cash declarations, for example, our legislation requires declarations of cash or bearer negotiable instruments at the border crossings. But this is very difficult to enforce when you have so many porous borders. Actually, with all the neighboring countries we have, anybody who wants to cross from one country to the other without declaring, there are so many motorable border crossings which are not gazetted. So all those made it extremely difficult for us to, and that's why one of the first issues we had to do was to carry out a national risk assessment. And then once we carried out this national risk assessment, we're able to know where the high risk areas are and the rest, and to determine the appropriate policies. So those are the main challenges we faced when we were creating.
Right.
Yes.
So, Sydney, you mentioned the national risk assessment, and I think that was conducted in 2017, if I'm right. And obviously, the purpose was to really guide the government's response to ML&TF and make sure that you can come up with an implementation plan. So, could you take us very quickly through maybe some of the key findings of the NRA? What were some of the recommendations, and over the last couple of years, what has been the progress since then based on those recommendations?
Now, we first the national risk, as I said, one of the first things we planned to do as a FIU was to coordinate the national risk assessment. Now, this national risk assessment was very important for Uganda because when our mutual evaluation was done in 2015, on the effectiveness scores, everything was low. And the reason why it was low is because we had not done a national risk assessment. Meaning, of course, if you have not done a national risk assessment or any other form of assessment, it means you cannot claim to know your risks. So because of that, our effectiveness in all the 11 areas was low. And one of the key priority recommendations in the mutual evaluation report for Uganda was for us to carry out a national risk assessment. So it served that purpose. But also it sets the baseline because this was the first ever. We had not done a national risk assessment before, and I was very privileged to be asked to lead the team that was coordinating the national risk assessment. So we used the World Bank tool. We used the World Bank tool to do the risk assessment, and we did in a very record time. It was within 9 months. We had already, because we're so determined, wanted to know, apart from addressing the issues of our obligations with the SMLAG, we also had to ensure that we know our own risks as as a country. So that was the most important, that was the background to it. And also for information, we are now reviewing it. We're going to update the national risk assessment. We're planning to do it. It is because of the interruptions of COVID pandemic, but by now we should have started the preliminary work. But nevertheless, we want to finish it. We had planned to finish it in June, but now we shall need to do the update maybe by the end of the year. And then in the middle of then next year, we shall do a completely new, a new one, so that we have an update national risk assessment. Now now the key findings, of course, there are several of them, but many of them confirmed actually what was in the mutual evaluation report. Right. So we're able to establish the crimes that generate both domestic, of course, domestically. It was corruption, it was fraud. These were the crimes internally that were generating the incomes, the incomes that were then the illegal proceeds that were then laundered. Then externally, we had, of course, transnational. We had illicit trade in the wildlife trade. There was smuggling of both counterfeit and other goods, including currency and cosmetics and other, and medicines. Then we also had lots of drug trafficking and human trafficking. These were the main cross-border crimes. Right. It also, and the risk was high. The vulnerabilities were very high. And then also terrorism financing. The terrorism risk is very high, and the terrorism financing risk is also very high. Now, in terms of the weaknesses, of course, were the ones that I've already mentioned. The fact that we are largely a cash-based economy, it was a problem to track transactions. We also have a lot of large informal businesses. We have porous borders. We have poor training of the agencies that are supposed to combat. So the law enforcement agencies, that is the police, the Inspectorate of Government, which deals with the public sector corruption. Then also the other administrative units like the Uganda Revenue Authority, which deals with tax matters, and also the Uganda Wildlife Authority. So there was a need identified to ensure that there's training for these organizations to be able to live up to the task of identifying and investigating money laundering and terrorism financing crimes, and also the crimes that generate those proceeds. Another key finding we made was the lack of integrity in the institutions that are supposed to combat this crime. So you have the findings, lack of integrity in the law enforcement was very high. The lack of integrity in the judiciary was very high. The lack of integrity in the regulators was also very high. So now, if you have a problem of inadequate training coupled with lack of integrity, you can see the difficulties that a country in that situation would face. Absolutely. And then, of course, there was also the general lack of awareness about obligations by the reporting entity. So we also found, apart from the banking sector, the general knowledge on MLCFT issues in all the other sectors was very low. And of course, once the knowledge is very low, it means compliance becomes a very big problem. So these were the key findings in our national risk assessment. Now, we also, the other finding was that the real estate was the area where most people wanted to invest these illegal proceeds. Now, the reason why real estate is appealing to the criminals to invest their funds in Uganda is because 80% of the land in Uganda is not titled. So you have only 20% that is titled. 80% is not titled. So it is possible for somebody actually to acquire a piece of property that is not registered anywhere. Right. It's not reflected in the land registry. The only piece of ownership, of course, is an agreement between the seller and the buyers, nothing else. And this is private, of course. if the seller and the buyer don't want to make it public, then no one will know. So this was the main factor. Now, even for the 20%, we also established that not, especially the criminals, they don't change the ownership. So somebody buys the land, they acquire the transfer documents, but they don't register. Right. So the land remains in the names of the seller, but when actually ownership has passed. So right. That's why it was very attractive for many people to invest in the criminal proceeds in real estate.
Right.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So, Sydney, you mentioned that the NRA showed, things like corruption, fraud, tax crimes, counterfeiting of goods were some yes. of the domestic, predicate offenses. And at a transnational level or external level, it was really smuggling, wildlife offenses, drug trafficking, human trafficking. Now, have you seen this changing either for the better or for the worse?
I think there's been improvement, a lot of improvement, because now the starting point is that we now know our risks. So I think I will highlight 4 areas. Number 1 is the allocation of resources for prevention, investigation, and prosecution. Now, obviously, we as the FIA, we have got more funding because we made the case to the Ministry of Finance and to government that, look, given the risks we have, our budget as FI has to be increased. So that has happened. We're happy with that. Although we're like Tom Thumb, we're still pushing for more. And then also once we did the national risk assessment, we also did an evaluation tool, an assessment and evaluation tool. So now we have the responsibility to ensure enforcement of because we made recommendations in the national risk assessment, short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. Now, the responsibility to ensure that these actions are complied with is given to our national task force. It's called the Uganda National MLCFT Task Force, which is chaired by the Ministry of Finance, and the FIA is the secretariat. Mm-hmm. So we did this evaluation tool as an annex to the NRA to see, and we assign responsibilities to every institution to ensure that things are done. Now, so every institution was required to make a case to the Ministry of Finance, to government through the Ministry of Finance, for them to be able to carry out what are the budgetary requirements for them to be able to carry out their respective obligations under the National Risk Assessment Toolbox. Now, the other thing we did was we combined the priority areas in the National Risk Assessment together with the ones in the Mutual Evaluation Report, so that we have one measurement tool, one assessment, one measurement tool. So that was the other unique thing that we did in our case. So that by addressing these issues, we're addressing the findings and priority areas both in the National Risk Assessment report and also the Mutual Evaluation report, as well as the ICRG report. So there's been an increase in the budgetary allocations to the various stakeholders, including ourselves. But of course, it is not to the levels that we want, but we are continuing to push. So that is one. Now, in terms of the legal framework, majority of the weaknesses in the legal framework have now been addressed. So our legal and institutional framework is now of the required international standards, and that's the reason why we are taken off the FATF grey list in November 2017, because we worked very hard with the different ministries, especially Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Internal Affairs and Ministry of Foreign Affairs to ensure that we have the legal framework and institutional framework. So that was the other issue. So those ones have largely been addressed. The one that is still a problem are the issues to do with the integrity and issues to do with the training, because integrity is personal. It takes a very long time to build people's personal and integrity, and of course that is a bigger problem because it is not unique to. It's not unique only to the ML-CFT fight. It cuts across the entire. So that is a bigger societal problem. So it's still a problem there. Obviously, when we talk of challenge of training, because we now have done a number of trainings, we have many technical assistance providers that have helped us with the training, especially the parallel financial investigations. We've had many trainings in that regard. But we have also, there's a court that was set up to handle corruption cases. So we lobbied the administration, the leadership of the judiciary, to ensure that money laundering cases are also prosecuted in this court. So we have a specific court to which all money laundering cases would go. Now, the other challenge we do have is that one of the other key findings, which I didn't mention earlier, was the issue with the beneficial ownership. It's still a problem. So one of the issues we still haven't addressed properly is the issue of access to beneficial ownership information. Now, before you even talk of access to beneficial ownership information, you must have a credible register, it's a register or source.
Yeah.
So we still don't have, we still haven't developed that. It is still pending. Now, we also, one of the things that was lacking was administrative penalties for institutions that do not comply with the law. Now, the FIA has now, one of the amendments to the anti-money laundering law was to grant FIA powers to issue administrative penalties without going to court. But before we can begin enforcing these penalties, we must develop the regulations. So the regulations are now being developed, and after that, we shall then begin applying these penalties so as to increase the compliance rate. Now, in terms of and then the other problem is the DNFPPs. It is the level of awareness has been very low, but and the risks, of course, for the different DNFPPs, the risk levels were different. For example, for advocates, it was very high. For accountants, it was not very high. And then for the dealers in precious metals, it was very high because we have a lot of smuggling, and we're neighbored by countries that are rich in mineral resources, so which transit through our country. So because of the different ratings but when we were doing one of the things we're doing as FIU is outreach to the reporting entities. So we started with the financial sector, the financial services, the banking, insurance, and the capital market securities. So we are now moving to the DNFPPs. Like you have already observed, we're still young ourselves. We of course, that was the other challenge. The other challenge is that the institution which is supposed to be at the center of this fight is young. And when you're young, you have many challenges, in-house challenges, because you have to set your governance structures, you have to set your internal policies. So the first 2 years, actually, we use them to develop our in-house internal policies, external policies, stakeholder engagement. So when you have a developing FIU in a high-risk environment like this, it also poses its own challenge. But we also, the other issue is that one of the things we have not yet done, but which we are planning to do, is to issue sector-specific guidance on how to comply, because many of the reporting entities have been coming to us and say, look, that the law is very general. You cannot expect the banks to comply in the same way like the insurance sector. So give us our specific guidance. So we agree, in principle, we say we agree. The same with the DNFPPs, the same with the NPOs. So one of the assignments I've given to the legal team for this financial ending June is for them to produce, and that is one of their key deliverables, to ensure that they produce guidance notes, which we shall then discuss with the stakeholders for each for the main reporting entities. So that they have no excuse of saying they don't understand this, they don't understand this. So, but we have also formed now the law. We have the money laundering control officers in the banks. So one of the things we have done about increasing the compliance levels, we have formed a forum between the FIA and the money laundering control officers, MLCO. So the forum we meet, the FIA is represented by our managers dealing with the operational analysis, dealing with the issues of compliance and legal. So these three, they regularly meet with the money laundering control officers of all the banks. So we intend to form similar forums with the other sectors. We wanted to form with the banks first to see how it works out. So that is another thing we've done to increase on the quality of the suspicious transaction reports, and also the quality of the quality and quantity of the suspicious transaction, because one of the challenges we had when we just started operations was the poor quality of the suspicious transaction reports. But now, because of these trainings, we now have better quality suspicious transaction reports, although there's still room for improvement as always. So we're saying that because of these vulnerability, these areas have now been addressed, but they're continuing to be addressed. Now, obviously, there are some sectors that are not very big.
Right.
For example, the advocates, the accountants, those ones are many, but the dealers in precious metals are not very many. And the problem with them is that they do not have a regulator. So the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development issues licenses, but issues of regulation are not done by the ministry. So there's no regulator. Right. Now, that is a very big challenge. The same applies with real estate agents. There's no regulator. The ministry, but we're working with the Ministry of Lands and Urban Development to develop a regulatory framework for real estate agents. But right now, there's anyone can simply start a real estate company and they start a business, apart from obtaining the trading license and things like that. So that is a very big, and yet real estate is one of the most it's one of the high-risk areas for investment of these proceeds of crime. So now we are saying before we can improve compliance in the real estate sector and also in the dealers of precious metals, we must first have the regulatory framework in place for those two. The same with the lawyers, because we're having engagements with the Uganda Law Society. But that is membership, as you know, self-regulatory body, and then self-regulatory bodies, they're supposed to help. Now, here, one of the accountants, the Institute of Certified Public Accountants, has been very cooperative. Mm-hmm. They've even drafted their own regulations on how their members should comply. So under the Accountants Act, but the level of acceptance we see in the accountancy profession is not the same, right? Like for the advocates. So we still have. So I've been having, since I'm a lawyer myself, I've taken advantage of our various legal fora to advance this cause, but I still detect a lot of resistance to the law. Now, unlike in other jurisdictions where I've seen lawyers challenging their inclusion among the reporting in court, in our case that did not happen. The lawyers have not challenged it, but there has been it's just that the compliance levels have been very low. So we are engaging the Law Society. We're also engaging the Uganda Law Council to see that the compliance levels are increased here. Now, in terms of general levels of crime, it has been very difficult to assess the illicit flows in and out of the country. Of course, one of the difficulties measuring illicit flows is that because of their very nature, it is secretive. So you don't have easy data to come across. So you can only use other means of estimating the inflows and outflows because they're illicit in nature. So
right.
it's very hard for me to place a figure on that. But going by the crime reports, we have seen a lot of increase. Obviously, once for example, now, and this is an ongoing discussion we have in our country here, whether because we're seeing more crimes. So is it because the crimes increasing, or is it because there's now more awareness and people are reporting these crimes? In my view, I think it is the latter. People are now becoming more aware and they're able to report to police. Now there's more training, so the detectives are able to pick out these crimes and investigate them and then take them to court. So, but the biggest problem is that we do not have proceeds of crime legislation. We do not have, because one of the ways of detecting this would be the confiscations and asset confiscations. Now, our asset confiscation legislation is very problematic because it is conviction based. We do not have civil-based confiscations here. So that makes it very difficult. And yet, the conviction rates are very low. So if the conviction rates are very low and you can only confiscate assets after conviction, it means what you're going to confiscate is going to be very, very limited in scope. So that is one of the biggest challenges, and we have been working very hard with the ministry, with the President's office and the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity to push the proceeds of crime legislation, which will now allow for civil forfeitures. Until that is, and of course our argument as FIA has been that until you have civil-based forfeitures in this country, then as recoveries of proceeds of crime is going to be, will continue to be a very big problem. Criminals will continue getting away with the proceeds of the things that they have stolen from both the private and public sector.
Right.
Now, terrorism financing is now we have been generally speaking very successful in fighting terrorism. So many potential terrorist activities have been disrupted. But one of the challenges we have seen is that there has been little appetite to investigate terrorism financing initially. Most of the concentration has been on terrorism, conviction for terrorism. So we have a number of convictions for terrorism, but not for terrorism financing. Now, we have been in discussions with the agencies involved in disrupting terrorism, as well as investigating it, to now say we must change our national. So as a country, we're finalizing the new, we're amending our national strategy to combat terrorism and terrorism financing to now concentrate. And one of the strategies we're going to insert there is to investigate and prosecute terrorism financing alongside the terrorist cases, which was not there because until 2015, terrorism financing was not a crime in Uganda. So since it was not a crime, we could not put it in the strategy. Yes.
Right. All right. So, Sydney, you touched briefly on the reporting, the suspicious transaction report. So I was browsing through the FI annual report for last year, and it showed an approximate increase of about 25% in STRs being filed over the previous year. And I think of these, about 85% were filed by commercial banks. And I think you also mentioned just now that you're also trying to now slowly increase the reach to the other sectors as well. So I think these numbers will change. But when you talk about, let's say, quality and quantity of reporting, what is your advice to reporting entities on how they should improve both the quality and quantity? Is it that they're not writing the ground of suspicion properly, so it makes it difficult for you to actually analyze those cases or go back and forth, and then it leads to some loss of time when you have to disseminate to law enforcement? Is there any particular prescription you have for them to improve this?
No, I think the challenge we had is that this was new. So there was nothing to compare against because we had to start from scratch. Now we have developed a form which the banks and other reporting entities are supposed to use. Now, in terms of the volume, we're not surprised that majority is from the banking sector because the banking sector by far is the largest in the financial institutions, in the financial sectors by far. So, for example, the insurance, the penetration of the capital markets or the securities industry in Uganda is very low. It is 0.75% of the GDP. So it tells you how small. And insurance is also less than 1%, although it is, the last time I checked, it might have gone slightly above 1%. So it is very low. Majority of it is, and we don't have many trusts here. So most of this is the banking, so is the biggest. So it is not a surprise that they have the biggest volume. And also in terms of materiality, in terms of risk, it is by far higher. So most of the trainings we had were concentrated with the banking industry. Now, in terms of, so, initially, actually, the volume was very high of reports, but many of the reports did not meet the threshold for what a suspicious transaction should be. So that was because, for example, many banks have mechanisms for identifying red flags. Now, there were initially many of these money laundering control officers will just, whatever is a red flag, they will not do any internal checks. They will simply file it as a suspicious transaction report. So we found ourselves dealing with so many reports that should not have been filed in the first place. But that was because, first of all, when we asked the banks to appoint the money laundering control officers, we insisted that this should be senior officials in the bank. Now, some banks decided to, and there was no requirement that somebody should be appointed to this specific role. So you could find someone else performing the role of an MLCO in addition to his or her other responsibilities in the bank. So we said as long as the other responsibilities do not negatively impact on their capacity to discharge the responsibilities of the money laundering control officer, that shouldn't be a problem. But most banks appointed junior bank officials to these positions. So these individuals did not have access within the bank. They did not have access to the required information to be able to make a proper. So we wrote a circular to make sure that the banks appointed senior officials to the positions of MLCO. So once that was addressed, the next issue was now continued training, because we said one of the most important parts of the form was to ensure that the part for the reasons or the basis for the suspicion. Many banks used to be very casual about filling that part, but now we train them and there's an improvement. And then, of course, experience, because there's now more training in-house, because majority of the banks in Uganda are subsidiaries of banks or subsidiaries. So many of them have group trainings, in-house group trainings, so that there's in-house group trainings, the trainings with us, and then also experience. When somebody has worked at a job over a period of time, they gain experience. So that has led to an improvement in the quality of the suspicious transaction reports. And there's also been, of course, the other reason why there's improvement is feedback from us, feedback from FIA back to the banks to say, look,
right,
this is good quality, you need to improve. So we have had a lot of one-on-one discussions with many MLCOs to see. So that has also led to the feedback from ourselves, has also led to improvement. So this cuts out the back and forth between ourselves and the banks and the reporting entities. The one area where we still have a lot of difficulties between the FIU and the law enforcement, because we have sent so many reports to law enforcement, but many of the reports we have sent have not been investigated. So we have been asking the law enforcement to tell us is there a problem with the quality of the reports we send to you? But we have not been receiving feedback on a regular basis. So that is not, we are not yet because the number of cases that have been taken to court for prosecution arising from the reports we are filed with law enforcement is still very, very low.
Right.
Now, obviously, with more training, the quantity has also increased from both within the banking community and also the other sectors. For example, now there are very many reports from the forex bureaus and money remittance companies, which is also another high risk area. So in our subsequent, because we make annual reports, so in our next annual report, you will see an increased number of reports from especially the money remittance and because money remittances and forex exchange is very big business. We have a lot of remittances in and out of the country, so there's also an improvement in that regard. Yes.
Right. Okay. So let me come to a slightly, maybe sensitive topic. So, at a global level, FATF has this process for mutual evaluation, also which you had mentioned earlier. And do you think the ranking of countries is done in a democratic way? And is it right to paint all countries with the same brush, especially as, many countries will have fewer resources in terms of funds or the right people or technology. So should there be different methodologies for different, I would say, types of countries based on their unique challenges so that they don't get unfairly positioned on the global stage?
Now, I think the whole mutual evaluation process has to be reformed, because the current way in which things are done is not, in my view, is not a fair one. Because, like you have rightly said, you cannot, yes, the international standards are the same, but when it comes to applying those standards and interpreting those standards, there must be a difference in those applications. Because, and in my view, the FSRBs should be given a greater leeway in this process, because especially the watch list, the way the watch list is done, the criteria for determining the countries on the watch list is not fair. And because it is not, and even the methodology is not fair. Now, because the methodology is not fair, the process is not fair, it means that you get distorted results. Because if you look at the 100 countries on the list, on the gray list, you ask yourself that, are these, really speaking, are these the countries in the globally that pose the greatest risks in the global MLCFT area? The answer is no. In my view, no. Yes, the countries which could have problems there because they might have weaknesses in their systems, but do they have to be on the system, on the global watch list? Certainly no. Somebody once remarked that the value in that list is not so much on who is on it, but who is not on it. You see, because you just need to take, because there are many ways you can assess to determine. Now, if you look at that list, there are some countries that have been in and out of that list in the last 3-4 years. But you see, but why? Because, take the example, I'll speak for I don't want to mention other countries, but take the example of Uganda. The referral to the gray list is based on the results of the mutual evaluation report. And it is also based on the second parameter is the what they call M3, the M3 being above $5 billion. Because initially Uganda was below the threshold. Yes, in terms of the results of the mutual evaluation report, we met the threshold referral, but we are below the 5 billion threshold as a country. But along the way, it was changed. You see, it was changed. and it was changed with limited consultation. For example, many countries in the global network were not aware of this change because of the way the meetings are structured. So, and then secondly, because the countries that meet the referral process, referral criteria based on the results of the mutual evaluation report were put in the, but were below the 5 billion threshold, were put in the pool. Correct. So the question is, if you change the methodology for determining the threshold of 5 billion from M2 to M3, should you apply it retrospectively? The answer is no, because if I was below the threshold today, then you change of determining the 5 billion, then you change the methodology tomorrow. You shouldn't, that methodology should apply going forwards, not backwards. So as a result, countries which were in the pool and had not met the threshold suddenly became met the threshold. You have Uganda and you have Zimbabwe. But this is not fair. So because when you know that you are on the, so that is just one example. So right. That it was done with limited consultation. Now, because the global community, because the full effective members, I think there are about 40 or thereabouts. Now everyone else is in the global community, and their representation at the effective meetings is through the FSRBs. But there's limited opportunity for the for serious discussions or serious representation. Forget about being physically present, because for you to appear and meaningfully engage, you must be according the right platform. So I think the GNCG does not have the appropriate platforms to express some of these concerns. But I think the process is, I think in addition to the two criterion, I think a greater access should be given to the FSRBs, because the FSRBs know their members better. Correct. And also in terms, it becomes, now with this pandemic, I think the situation is even going to be worse. I think you have already seen on the FATF president's late issue, I think it was in report, one of the worries expressed by developing economies is that because of the financial burden brought about by the disaster brought about by the pandemic, many governments are going to change priorities. And there's a very high risk that combating MLCFT might be low on the priority list of many countries because they are recovering from the effect. Now, what impact is that going to have on the work of agencies involved in the fight against ML, especially the FIUs and the law enforcement agencies? So there's a very high risk. You know, we like doing risk assessments and the rest. So if you ask yourself the question that for countries that have been financially hit as a consequence of the COVID pandemic, what is the risk that MLCFT is going to, combating MLCFT is going to be low on the priority risk, priority list of governments. So that's the assessment that we have to do. So obviously we have to continue pushing. And then of course so that process has to be reformed by giving the FSRBs greater say, because the FSRBs are the ones, I think. So one of the ways, for example, I think this can be improved is to decentralize the gray listing process. That the gray listing process should now be left to the FSRBs, and then the FATF should concentrate on its full members. So for the full members of the FATF, those ones can now be, they can handle their full membership. But then for the FSRBs, the final say on where the country should be placed on the global, at least I think that should be left to the FSRBs, because they know these countries better, they understand the issues of the countries, and they're also the ones who do the assessments. So that is one way of making this a more democratic process, rather than using one shoe fits
Right.
one shoe
Right.
fits yes. So, and of
Absolutely.
course, we're not saying this because, for example, Uganda is on the list, but
Right.
it's a view that is shared by quite a number of countries.
Right, right. No, very interesting, and I think very valid points that you've brought up in this. Sydney, in closing, what would you say, are some of the notable achievements that the FIA had over the last 6 years of existence, and what are your expectations going forward from your entire reporting entity pool, for the near future?
Yeah, of course, we are very proud because we coordinated the national risk assessment, and given the fact that it was the first risk assessment for the country, so we're very proud that and of course, our risk assessment has received a lot of positive. We have received a lot of positive feedback, because with many countries, when they are doing self-assessments, they tend to sweep many things under the carpet. But in our case, we didn't do that. We put everything on the table and we're addressing them. So that is something I'm very proud about. Obviously, we worked very hard to get Uganda off the grey list in 2017, although we have now been put back on the grey list, but it doesn't take away the achievement of getting off the list in the first time round. We are also of course, we also coordinated the mutual evaluation report. The mutual evaluation in 2015, which was not an easy responsibility. And then also we have joined in July last year. We admitted as members of the Egmont Group. Now we are very proud because we're one of the newest FIUs. Many FIUs that came into existence long before us are not members. So the fact that we're able to join within a very relatively short time means that, of course, before you're admitted, you need to meet certain minimum thresholds. So the fact that we are now welcome to the global FIU community is a very great achievement for us. And of course, we know it's going to increase and improve on our access to information across the 164 members. Now, in terms of the expectations, obviously we continue to engage with the account reporting entities. We call them accountable persons.
Accountable persons, yeah.
Yes. Now, of course, because we're now in the ICRG process for the next 2 years, we are going to concentrate a lot on doing the issues attending to the issues which are in the action plan with FATF. For example, setting up a beneficial ownership register or other means of people accessing credible beneficial ownership information. Then we're also going to work on, and of course the banks, the private sector has a lot to play here together with our company registry. We are going to work with NGOs. We have some studies with typologies we want to do. We have to do some risk assessment, for example, with NPO sector to determine their vulnerability to terrorism financing risk as required by recommendation 8 of the standards. We also are going to do a risk of the legal persons and trusts, the MLCFT risks that are posed by legal persons and trusts. As I've already mentioned, we're going to amend and improve on our national MLCFT strategy. Training, we have continued training for everybody, for ourselves, for the law enforcement agencies, and also for the reporting entities, so that they continue improving on the quality of the reports. But also the other compliance obligations, because reporting suspicious transaction reports is just one of the many compliance requirements. So the law, actually one of the things we're doing is we have required all the banks and mobile money companies, because I think I didn't mention that mobile money is very big here. Mobile money transactions is very big. So we have required all mobile money companies, because they're also reporting entities, and the banks to file with us what we call the independent audit compliance. Okay. So that means that they have to engage audit firms to do an independent assessment of how these institutions have complied with the laws.
Right.
From the time the law was created in the law came into force in 2013 up to date. So that, and we initially gave the deadline of April 30th, but of course, because of the COVID pandemic, we've extended it to 30th of June. So we're now going to get these reports and look, because this is an independent audit by an audit firm,
right.
and we had to approve the appointment of these audit firms so that we are satisfied that it's going to be a credible report. So these reports are going to guide us on our engagement with these particular reporting entities. For example, if they say that this bank's identification of STR process is a problem, if that is picked out as an audit issue, then we'll say, okay, what is the remedial step? Say in the next 6 months, please improve your parameters for identifying suspicious transactions.
Right.
Yes, they'll say, if, for example, they have not been filing large cash transaction reports on time, we shall address that issue as well. And of course, plus there are many other compliance obligations. So that is going to be one of the things we're going to do over the next, for the remainder of this year, from between July to December. And then that will guide us on how we continue to engage. We also, with these particular institutions, we also plan to increase our outreach to all the other, we have 15 categories of reporting entities we intend to reach. We also intend to increase our outreach to, including the DNF
DNFPBs. Right. Excellent. So, Sydney, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us here on Fridays with Fintelekt. All the things you mentioned, I think you do have a huge number of challenges, but I think you seem well placed to, and you seem to have your plan in place to, address all of them. So I wish you and, the entire team at FIA all the best for your future endeavors. And, hope you're out of the grey list soon. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, Sydney. So listeners, please join us again next Friday for the next session. This is Shirish and Sydney signing out.